In 1950, Detroit was the fourth largest city in America. It had more millionaires per capita than almost anywhere else on Earth. Its factories built the cars that built the American middle class. Its skyline rivaled New York's. Here's a fact that sounds almost impossible today. In 1950, Detroit had a higher median income than the national average, and it was one of the only major American cities where a factory worker with no college degree could realistically afford to buy a home, a car, and a boat. Today, entire neighborhoods stand empty. Skyscrapers sit hollow, their marble lobbies filled with pigeon droppings and fallen ceiling tiles. Photographers travel from across the world just to shoot the decay, a genre so specific it has its own name: ruin porn. So what actually happened here? How does a city lose over 1 million people, get stripped for scrap, and become a symbol of American collapse, all in the span of a single lifetime? This is the story of Detroit, and it's more complicated and more human than the photographs ever show. To understand Detroit's fall, you first have to understand its rise, because nothing in history falls from a height it never reached. In the early 20th century, Detroit became the beating heart of American industry almost by accident. Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile, but in 1913 he perfected something more important: the moving assembly line. A Model T that once took 12 hours to build now took 90 minutes. Wages for factory workers doubled overnight to $5 a day, an almost unthinkable sum that let Ford's own employees afford the cars they were building. Here's an interesting detail most people don't know. Ford's $5 day came with strings attached. The company created a so-called sociological department that sent investigators into workers' homes to check whether they were drinking too much, gambling, or living in what Ford considered an immoral way. If you failed the inspection, you didn't get the raise. It was generous and controlling at the same time, a pattern that would echo through Detroit's whole relationship with its workers for the next century. Word spread. Dodge, Packard, General Motors, Chrysler, they all set up shop in and around Detroit. By the 1920s, the city had a nickname that said everything: Motor City. Then came World War II, and Detroit's factories didn't slow down. They transformed. The Ford Willow Run plant, built specifically for the war, became the largest factory under one roof anywhere in the world at the time. At its peak, it produced one B-24 Liberator bomber almost every single hour. President Roosevelt gave Detroit a new title that stuck for decades: the Arsenal of Democracy. Another fact worth knowing: Detroit's wartime factories didn't just build planes and tanks. They also employed the first large wave of women in heavy industrial jobs. The real-life women behind the Rosie the Riveter image were disproportionately Detroit factory workers, welding bomber fuselages that had been built by men just a few years earlier. By 1950, the population had ballooned past 1.85 million people. Neighborhoods overflowed. Workers, many of them black families migrating from the rural South in what historians call the Great Migration, arrived by the thousands, chasing factory jobs that paid enough to buy a house and send kids to college. Detroit's black population grew from around 40,000 in 1920 to nearly 300,000 by 1950, one of the fastest demographic shifts of any American city in that era. Detroit wasn't just an industrial city. It was proof that American manufacturing could build not just cars, but a stable, prosperous working class almost overnight. A few more facts from this golden era are worth knowing. The Fisher Building, completed in 1928 in Detroit's New Center neighborhood, was covered in gold leaf and marble imported from Africa and Europe, and was nicknamed Detroit's largest art object. Its architect, Albert Kahn, designed so many of the city's factories, including Ford's Highland Park and River Rouge plants, that he's sometimes credited with inventing the modern factory as an architectural form, and his firm's designs were later studied and copied by Soviet engineers building their own tractor factories in the 1930s. Detroit also had one of the largest and most ornate movie palaces in the world when the Michigan Theater opened in 1926, seating over 4,000 people beneath a ceiling modeled on the Palace of Versailles. Decades later, after the theater closed, its owners couldn't afford to demolish the ornate shell, so they gutted the interior and turned it into something almost absurd: a multi-level parking garage where for years commuters parked their cars beneath the original gilded ceiling and chandeliers. It's still used as a parking structure today and remains one of the most photographed ruins in the city, even though, technically, it's still in active use. But that same machine that built Detroit up would eventually take it apart, piece by piece. The first crack in Detroit's foundation wasn't an economic crisis. It was concrete. Starting in the 1950s, the federal government poured billions into the interstate highway system. In most cities, that meant new roads to the suburbs. In Detroit, it meant something more specific. Highways were routed directly through thriving black neighborhoods like Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, demolishing homes, churches, and black-owned businesses that had taken generations to build. Paradise Valley, in particular, is worth pausing on. It was once considered the Harlem of the Midwest, a several-block strip of jazz clubs, black-owned theaters, and restaurants where legends like Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald performed regularly. By the mid-1960s, almost all of it had been bulldozed to make way for I-375, a highway that, ironically, city planners have spent the last several years actively studying how to remove and replace with a boulevard, admitting the original project caused lasting damage. At the same time, those same highways made it easier than ever for white, middle-class families to leave the city entirely. This wasn't random. It was accelerated by a well-documented practice called redlining, where banks and government agencies literally drew red lines on maps around black neighborhoods, marking them as hazardous for lending, while making it easy for white families to get low-interest mortgages in the new suburbs. Detroit's 8-Mile Road, later immortalized in the Eminem film, was originally reinforced by a literal 6-foot-tall concrete wall built in 1941, specifically to separate a black neighborhood from a proposed white housing development so the white development could qualify for federal loan backing. Sections of that wall still stand today, now covered in murals. The pattern this created is often called white flight, and Detroit experienced one of the most extreme versions of it in the country. Between 1950 and 1970, Detroit lost hundreds of thousands of residents, not because the jobs disappeared yet, but because the people who could leave did. And as they left, so did the tax base that funded schools, roads, and city services. Then, in July 1967, decades of tension over housing discrimination, police brutality, and job discrimination erupted after a police raid on an unlicensed after-hours bar on 12th Street. 5 days of civil unrest followed. Over 40 people died, more than 7,000 were arrested, and roughly 2,000 buildings burned. President Johnson had to send in the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, federal paratroopers, on American streets to restore order. It remains one of the deadliest riots in American history. The 1967 uprising didn't cause Detroit's decline on its own. The deeper economic forces were already in motion, but it accelerated everything. More businesses closed, more families left, and the image of Detroit in the national imagination began to shift from Motor City to something more troubled. One lesser-known fact: the specific after-hours bar that police raided in 1967 was known locally as a blind pig, a Prohibition-era slang term for an illegal, unlicensed drinking establishment that had survived in Detroit for decades after Prohibition ended, simply because it was a convenient way to get around Michigan's strict bar closing hours. That night, police expected to arrest a handful of people. Instead, they found roughly 85 people inside celebrating the return of two local soldiers from Vietnam, and the scale of the arrest itself is what sparked the crowd that gathered outside. It's also worth noting what Detroit did have. Even during this period of tension, Belle Isle, an enormous 982-acre island park in the Detroit River designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the same landscape architect behind New York's Central Park. At the time it was built in the 1880s, it was considered one of the most ambitious urban parks in the country, complete with its own aquarium, conservatory, and yacht club, and it remained a beloved gathering place for Detroiters of all backgrounds even as the rest of the city grew more divided. Here's the part of the story that often gets left out of the photographs. Detroit's collapse wasn't sudden. It was a slow-motion economic earthquake that played out over 50 years. In the 1970s, the oil crisis hit American automakers hard. Suddenly, fuel-efficient Japanese cars, Toyotas, Hondas, Datsuns, looked a lot more appealing than gas-guzzling American sedans. Detroit's big three automakers were slow to adapt, and market share that once seemed untouchable began sliding to overseas competitors. By 1980, Japanese automakers had captured over 20% of the U.S. car market, a number that would have seemed like science fiction to a Detroit executive in 1955. At the same time, a bigger structural shift was underway: automation. Robots could now do jobs that once required dozens of human workers. A single assembly line that employed 5,000 people in 1955 might employ 1,500 by 1985, same output, a fraction of the jobs. General Motors alone eliminated tens of thousands of Detroit-area manufacturing jobs during the 1980s through automation and plant consolidation, even while the company remained profitable overall. And then there was outsourcing. As global trade opened up, it became cheaper to manufacture parts, and eventually entire vehicles, in Mexico and later overseas. Plants that had anchored entire Detroit neighborhoods for generations shut their doors for good. The Packard plant, once one of the most advanced automobile factories on Earth when it opened in 1903, the first reinforced concrete factory building in the world, closed permanently in 1958 and has sat abandoned ever since, making it, for decades, one of the largest abandoned industrial complexes on the planet at roughly 3.5 million square feet. Each factory closure set off a chain reaction economists call a multiplier effect. For every direct manufacturing job lost, an estimated 3 to 5 additional local jobs disappeared too. The diner near the plant, the barber shop, the corner store, the mechanic. The workers who lost jobs stopped spending at local shops. Those shops closed. The city lost tax revenue. City services got cut. And as services got worse, anyone who could afford to leave did. By 1990, Detroit's population had fallen from a peak of 1.85 million to under 1.1 million. By 2010, it was under 715,000. A nearly two-thirds drop from its 1950 peak. To put that in perspective, Detroit lost roughly the equivalent of the entire population of San Francisco just in people leaving the city limits. One especially strange fact from this era: Because so many homes were abandoned, Detroit at one point had entire residential blocks with only one or two occupied houses left standing, surrounded on all sides by empty lots or collapsing structures. City planners eventually coined a term for this landscape, urban prairie, because in some areas the land had genuinely reverted to tall grass and wildflowers, with deer and pheasants regularly spotted within the city limits. Another strange fact from this era of decline: Detroit's abandonment wasn't limited to factories and homes. It swallowed entire cultural institutions too. The Book Tower, a 38-story neo-Renaissance skyscraper completed in 1926 and once one of the tallest buildings in the world outside New York, sat almost completely empty from the early 2000s until a roughly $313 million renovation reopened it in 2023. And Central United Methodist Church, sitting directly across from Comerica Park where the Detroit Tigers play, actually kept its doors open through the entire decline, becoming known instead as a site of civil rights organizing. Malcolm X gave his famous message to the grassroots speech in Detroit in 1963, just a short distance from where the church still stands today. The city that once built the machines that built America was now hollowing out, block by block. Before we get to how Detroit hit rock bottom, here are a few numbers and facts that put the scale of this collapse into perspective. Detroit is one of very few major world cities to have lost more than half its population without a war, famine, or natural disaster to blame. Cities like Aleppo or Sarajevo lost population due to active conflict. Detroit lost it almost entirely to economic and policy decisions, spread out peacefully over decades. At its peak, Detroit had one of the highest homeownership rates of any major American city, in part because factory wages were so reliable that banks were comfortable issuing mortgages to blue-collar workers, a rarity in most of the country at the time. By the 2010s, that same city had one of the highest home foreclosure rates in the nation, with some entire zip codes seeing over 50% of properties go through foreclosure during the housing crisis of 2008. Here's a fact that surprises people. Despite its reputation for total abandonment, at no point did Detroit's population actually reach zero in any neighborhood. Even the most photographed ghost block images typically still had a handful of occupied homes just outside the camera frame, whose owners refused offers to relocate and stayed through the worst of the decline, often for decades, maintaining their properties alone on otherwise empty streets. Detroit is also the birthplace of Motown Records, founded by Berry Gordy in 1959 with an $800 loan from his family. The label's original headquarters, a modest house nicknamed Hitsville, USA, recorded artists like the Supremes, Stevie Wonder, and Marvin Gaye. And remarkably, that specific building survived the entire decline completely intact and now operates as the Motown Museum, one of the very few Detroit landmarks from the golden era that was never abandoned for a single day. And on the subject of cars, even during Detroit's darkest financial years, the region never actually stopped making vehicles. Metro Detroit still produces more cars than the entire country of Mexico's original auto industry did in the 1980s, and it remains headquarters to General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, formerly Chrysler. To this day, the Big Three nickname never went away, even when the city itself nearly did by the 2000s. Detroit's city government was trying to run a metropolis built for 2 million people with the tax base of a city a third that size. The math simply didn't work. Streetlights went dark across entire neighborhoods because there wasn't money to fix them. By some estimates, roughly 40% of the city's streetlights were non-functional at the low point. Ambulance response times stretched to nearly an hour in some areas, compared to a national average closer to 7 minutes. Only a third of the city's ambulances were even operational on a given day. In July 2013, it became official. Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, with the city listing somewhere between $18 and $20 billion in debt. The bankruptcy forced brutal decisions. Retired city workers, police officers, firefighters, bus drivers saw their pensions cut. The city's massive art collection at the Detroit Institute of Arts, which included works by Van Gogh, Bruegel, and Matisse valued at potentially billions of dollars, was nearly sold off piece by piece to pay creditors. It was saved at the last minute by an unusual arrangement called the Grand Bargain, in which national foundations, the state of Michigan, and the DIA itself pooled roughly $800 million to protect the art in exchange for softening the cuts to retiree pensions. Detroit emerged from bankruptcy in December 2014, just 17 months after filing, remarkably fast for a case that size, and often cited by other struggling cities as a model for how to restructure municipal debt quickly. But emerging from bankruptcy didn't undo 6 decades of population loss and abandonment. It just meant the city could start, slowly, trying to rebuild. A detail that surprised a lot of legal experts at the time. The bankruptcy judge overseeing the case, Stephen Rhodes, took the unusual step of personally visiting blighted Detroit neighborhoods during the proceedings, saying he wanted to see the human impact of the numbers he was reading in court filings, not just the balance sheets. And even after the Grand Bargain saved the DIA's collection, retirees still saw pension cuts of around 4.5% for general city retirees and larger cuts to cost of living adjustments for police and fire retirees. Reductions that many former city workers are still feeling in their monthly checks today. And that abandonment is exactly what created the images the world now associates with Detroit. As people left Detroit, they didn't just leave their jobs behind. They left buildings, tens of thousands of them. At the city's lowest point, an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 structures sat abandoned, from small single-family homes to enormous factories to an 18-story former train station that stood empty for 3 decades. These buildings became something unexpected, an aesthetic. Photographers began traveling to Detroit specifically to shoot the decay, crumbling ballrooms, forests growing through gymnasium floors, grand pianos rotting in abandoned mansions, thousands of books still sitting on shelves in a school library exactly where they'd been left. Coffee table books were published, most famously the 2010 book, The Ruins of Detroit, by French photographers Yves Marchand and Romain Meffer, which sold internationally and helped turn abandoned Detroit into a globally recognized visual genre almost overnight. The term that emerged to describe this genre was ruin porn, a phrase coined to critique photography that finds beauty in urban collapse without engaging with the people or history behind it. Detroit-based journalist and photographer James D. Griffioen, who is sometimes credited with popularizing the term around 2009, later said he regretted contributing to a genre that flattened decades of complex history into pretty pictures of decline. Here's a detail that surprises a lot of people. Some of the most photographed abandoned locations in Detroit weren't actually abandoned in the way tourists assumed. The Michigan Central Station, for instance, was privately owned the entire time it sat empty. Its owner, billionaire Matty Moran, was widely criticized for letting the building decay for decades rather than either restoring or demolishing it, reportedly because of a long-running dispute over how the city and county planned to redevelop the surrounding area. And the ruin porn term stuck because it captured something uncomfortable. Outsiders were profiting through book sales, gallery shows, viral photo essays, even guided ruin tours that some entrepreneurs briefly ran for curious tourists. From images of a tragedy that was still actively happening to hundreds of thousands of real Detroiters. Local writers and residents pushed back hard, arguing that ruin photography often erased Black Detroiters entirely from a story that was, at its core, about them, about the neighborhoods hollowed out by highways, redlining, and disinvestment. As one frequently cited critique put it, the photos showed the buildings, but almost never the people still living next door to them. That tension is still unresolved today. Ruin photography can be genuinely striking, a reminder of how quickly human ambition can be reclaimed by nature and time. But critics argue it too often functions like disaster tourism, beautiful from a distance, but detached from the lived reality of the people who never left. Not every Detroiter responded to the decay by ignoring it or resenting outsiders who photographed it. Some turned it into art of their own. Artist Tyree Guyton, frustrated by watching his childhood neighborhood on Heidelberg Street get abandoned house by house through the 1980s, started painting entire derelict homes with bright polka dots and attaching found objects, stuffed animals, shoes, clocks, vacuum cleaners, directly onto their exteriors. The result, called the Heidelberg Project, has now been running for nearly 40 years, has survived multiple city demolition attempts, and even several suspicious arson fires that destroyed individual houses in the installation, and draws roughly 200,000 visitors a year, making it one of the only ruin-related attractions actually created and run by the community it depicts, rather than by outside photographers to "Oh, what does Detroit actually look like today?" The honest answer is, two different cities at once. Downtown and Midtown have seen genuine, well-documented investment. Billionaire businessman Dan Gilbert, founder of Rocket Mortgage, has bought and restored more than 100 properties in downtown Detroit since 2010, pouring in billions of dollars and moving thousands of his own employees into the city center. Ford Motor Company bought Michigan Central Station, once the most photographed ruin in America, and spent roughly $950 million restoring it, reopening it in June 2024 as a hub for mobility and tech startups, complete with the original marble ceilings fully restored. But drive 15 minutes from downtown into neighborhoods like Brightmoor or the East Side, and the story is very different. Vacant lots, many now converted into urban farms or simply left as fields, still outnumber occupied homes on some blocks. Interestingly, Detroit has become one of the largest urban agriculture experiments in America almost by necessity, with over 1,400 registered community gardens and farms now growing food on land that used to hold houses. Population has stabilized somewhat, even ticking up slightly in recent census estimates for the first time in nearly 7 decades. A small but symbolically significant reversal after 70 straight years of decline. But the city is still a fraction of its former size. Detroit isn't the empty, apocalyptic wasteland that viral photo essays sometimes suggest. It's also not the fully revitalized comeback story that some headlines claim. It's a city of contrasts, genuine renewal in some areas, generational neglect still visible in others, and roughly 630,000 people living their actual lives somewhere in between the two extremes. One fact that captures this contrast well: Detroit is now home to a fully functional 1.35-mile stretch of public road embedded with wireless charging technology for electric vehicles, opened in 2023 as part of a state-backed pilot program. a genuinely futuristic piece of infrastructure sitting just a few miles from residential blocks that still lack basic streetlights. The same city government that once couldn't afford to fix its own street lamps is now also home to one of the largest concentrations of autonomous vehicle testing and battery research in the country, as GM, Ford, and dozens of startups have rebuilt research campuses on the same land where earlier generations of factories once stood. Before we wrap up, three quick myths worth clearing up, because they come up in almost every comment section under a Detroit video. Myth 1. Detroit is the most dangerous city in America. It's true Detroit has struggled with high crime rates, particularly in the 1970s through the 1990s. But violent crime in Detroit has actually fallen substantially since its early 1990s peak, tracking a broader nationwide crime decline. And by the early 2020s, several other U.S. cities recorded higher per capita violent crime rates in various years. The most dangerous city label gets applied to Detroit constantly in listicles, but the ranking shifts depending on the year and the methodology used. Myth 2. Nobody lives downtown anymore. In reality, downtown and midtown Detroit have some of the lowest residential vacancy rates in the entire city today, and downtown's residential population has grown substantially since 2010, driven largely by young professionals moving into converted loft apartments in buildings that were themselves abandoned office towers just 15 years earlier. Myth 3. The whole city looks like the ruined photos. As we covered earlier, the most photographed ruins represent a small handful of specific buildings: Michigan Central Station, the Packard plant, a few schools and theaters that got photographed thousands of times each, creating the impression that ruin was everywhere. Meanwhile, the vast majority of Detroit's roughly 140 square miles is made up of ordinary residential streets, functioning businesses, and neighborhoods that never appeared in a single viral photo essay, simply because occupied houses with families inside make far less dramatic photography than an empty ballroom. The Detroit story isn't really about a city that failed. It's about what happens when industrial capitalism, racial discrimination, and shifting global trade all collide in one place over the course of just a few decades. The ruins that made Detroit famous online are real, but they're not the whole story. They're the visible scar tissue of policy decisions, corporate decisions, and historical forces that most photographs never explain. The next time you see a stunning photo of an abandoned Detroit ballroom or a forest growing through a school gymnasium, it's worth asking, what happened here, and to whom? Because behind every one of those images is a decades-long story of a city that built the modern world, and then was left to rebuild itself, one neighborhood at a time. Subscribe for more What Happened to videos.